But we have to move on to our next speaker, who is Bridget Bawlya Umar. She's a researcher and a senior lecturer at University of Zambia, and she teaches courses and conducts research related to sustainable land management, climate change, gender, and natural resource management. Welcome, Bridget.
Thank you very much. I can go ahead.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. So as earlier introduced, my name is Bridget Bawlya Umar. I work at the University of Zambia as a senior lecturer, and I'm also a fellow for the Food Systems Research Network in Africa. I'll talk more about that later. And I'm also a member of the Zambian Women in Agriculture Research and Development. And this is a membership-based organization whose aim is really to promote women researchers, as well as practitioners that are engaged in the agriculture sector. So I'll also talk a little bit more about that later. We can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I was invited to talk about food systems research in Africa. So as a starting point, I asked myself the question, what is a food system in Africa? And then, of course, it's not one thing. Depending on how you categorize Africa, you can end up with different categorizations for food systems. So I gave 3 examples here. So on my far left, probably on your right for your case, if you think of Africa based on its agroecological systems, then you end up with those 16 different categorizations. So you think about maybe the rainfall, the temperature, the soils, what are the suitable crops in a particular region, and then a food system will result from that. And of course, by food system, we include all the different actors along the value chain, or the different stakeholders, or the different players. Basically, anyone who's engaged in the foods, in the production of food, in the transportation of food, in the processing, and of course, ending up with the consumption. And then the one in the middle is the straightforward one used by the African Union, where they divide Africa into economic commissions. So there's one in the north, in the southern part, in the east, west, central, and increasingly they also tend to think of the diaspora also as one group. And then my last example here is where you look at the sort of the types of crops grown or the farming systems, and then you focus on things like maize, which is also quite dominant in the tropics, the tubers, the perennials, and then the pastoral systems. So whichever one you pick, you see that you end up discussing food systems from a particular context. But despite the diversity, there's also several commonalities, which I'll talk about now. Please move to the next slide. Yeah, so some commonalities. Yes, it's 54 African countries, but you see that most of them have a shared history of colonization and the development. And so this history of colonization affects sort of the kind of food systems that are there today. So for instance, in Zambia, this means that we are very obsessed with the growing of maize and the consumption of maize. So right now in my culture, if you visit me, I have to serve you a dish that includes a meal made from maize. I don't do that, you can even take it as an offense. And this is all because during the colonial period, maize production was very much encouraged on the copper belt, and being raised on the copper belt, that's all we ever consumed. And even after we got independence, we continued with policies on maize production. So you see that colonial history still tends to have an influence on the kind of food systems that we have today. And this is very common across African countries. It may be different foods, different food cultures, but there's always that trend of the colonial influence. And then, of course, we tend to think about the terms under which African countries are included in the world food system. I remember every time I was in Sweden or Norway, if I go into a supermarket, I look at the vegetable and fruit section, and I see all these perfect cabbages that they're the same size, the bananas are the same size, they look the same color, they taste the same. And I just think to myself, no smallholder farmer in Zambia is able to produce that. So definitely these foods are not coming from there, and makes it a little bit difficult to expect our smallholder farmers to be able to supply those kinds of goods. So it's effectively a way of keeping them out. And this is very common for smallholder farmers across Africa. If they have to participate in agriculture trade, then they have to meet these stringent conditions. So this is something that is quite common. And then on a more positive side, please move to the next slide. Yeah, we have good things happening all across the continent. For instance, I give an example here of the African Union. Increasingly, trade is being promoted among African countries. So, for instance, through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And with COVID, we actually, I think, woke up because we woke up and found that we couldn't get things that we had always taken for granted, that they'll be shipped into the country. So now there's a talk about increasing trade, trading more with our neighbors and with our regions. For instance, if you go back to the regions I showed there. So for instance, if it is a southern region, can we trade more like that? Or yeah, so like this one. So for instance, in Southern Africa, so that would mean SADC, so maybe Zambia trading more with its neighbors, other than importing food from much further places, and also just local production within Zambia. Can we do more production? So that is something that has increasingly come up. Then of course we have initiatives like CADIP. So this has increased the attention that governments are paying to agriculture. So for instance, there's an aspiration that every government should spend about 10% of its national budgets on the agriculture sector. So if you're doing that, then definitely there's more funding, there's more political will than what was there before. So yeah, with this brief background, then I can talk about my research. Go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll talk about the research that I'm doing. Of course, there's a lot of research happening in Africa. So I'll talk about the one that I'm familiar with because I'm participating in that. And this is what is known as the Food Systems Research Network for Africa. And so this is a consortium of 10 universities in Africa. And from each university, there are 2 researchers who are known as fellows. And each fellow is at postdoctoral level, so everyone with a PhD and early career. And the idea really is to develop a cadre of researchers to conduct research on food systems in Africa. So not in the traditional way of everyone working in their small silo, but sort of focusing on the collaboration across the continent and making sure that the research is not just the traditional lab research we do, or just if you go to your stakeholders, you just talk to one stakeholder, but more about, can we do collaborative research that will bring about change in the food systems to make them equitable, to make them sustainable. And at the end of it, this research should be impactful because it is also contributing to policy development and policy change. So there's a focus again on engaging with policymakers, stakeholder engagement, not just with fellow researchers, but also with policymakers, with producers, and basically anyone who has anything to do with food systems research. So hopefully at the end of 2 years, we'll see a change, at least something being catalyzed from this cohort of early career African stakeholders. So it's starting from, we have 6 themes. If you look at the 20 fellows from 10 different countries, we have 6 themes, and ideally they cover sort of the main issues in food systems research. So the first theme, for example, is governance and equality. Then there's innovations on food loss and waste. As you are aware, a lot of food is wasted from production until it gets to the table. which is very costly because if you are a farmer and maybe you lose half of your tomatoes before you even get to the market, then that's an important loss. So some of the researchers are working on that. Others are focusing on the crop and livestock farming, which is also important among smallholder farmers in Africa. So essentially, how can we enhance both the crop and both the livestock and do it in a sustainable manner? Then there's innovations, and then the role of grains, meat, and nutrition. So with increasing population and sort of increasing economic activities, you find that more households are going to reach the middle income category. And when they do that, then the meat consumption increases, there's more demand for dairy products, etc., etc. So how can we enhance the production of meat, the production of grains, and also not forgetting nutrition, and doing all this in a sustainable manner? And then the last one is on agricultural value chains. So this is a big one now. Yes, we know about production, but half the problem is that after smallholders produce, then they don't have access to markets. What happens then? And what are the terms on which they're participating in markets? Like the example I gave, how do we get smallholders to sort of supply to big markets in Europe and things like that? So my own research, and it's from the first category there, I'm focused on climate resilient and equitable and sustainable agriculture intensification. So this is in Zambia, and this decision, because most of our producers, our smallholder farmers, depend on rain for production, really. So with the increased variability in climate, and this is manifested in higher temperatures, so there's flooding, and then there are droughts. And the response by farmers usually is to cultivate larger land areas. That's the way they try to improve their total production. And this means opening up forests, and this is not sustainable at all. So the idea is, how can we get our farmers, how can we help our farmers to use the same amount of land, but get more produce from it, and do this while adapting to the climate change and the increased climate variability. Then I'm also interested in customary land governance because most of our land is customary land. So this means that it is governed by chiefdoms and traditional leadership. So access to land is through belonging to a chiefdom. So if you're a man, if you're a woman, if you've lived in the area for a long time, or if you're a recent migrant, all that is going to affect how you access land. And of course, as the farmer, land is the most important resource. And we found that farmers' decision to adopt sustainable agriculture intensification has a lot to do with, are they secure in their land ownership? Nobody wants to plant a tree when they are not sure that they'll secure the benefits of that tree 10, 15 years from now. So this is also an important dynamic. Then, of course, I look at the role of gender in the agricultural value chain. As you see from the picture there, women are not just producers. They are also expected to perform their reproductive roles. So to look after children, to get firewood, to cook food. But if they are doing this, then to what extent can they really participate in productive activities? To what extent can they participate in markets? So this is something that is very important that I think we need to understand if we're going to help really address the inequalities along the value chain. Then for purposes of this discussion, my last one is political agronomy of international development aid. And why I focus on this is because, again, we get a lot of donor funds into the agriculture sector. And usually when donor money is brought into the country, it's specific. Is it conservation agriculture? Is it climate smart agriculture? Is it agroforestry? So we end up essentially as researchers researching on the agenda of the donors. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad. It is bad when it's not appropriate for what we should be doing. So I'm looking at what is the best way to access sort of donor funds for our farmers in a way that will benefit them. Then, as I said earlier, I'm also participating in ZAWAD, the Zambian Women in Agriculture Research and Development. So we have a project where we're trying to address some of these challenges. So basically training women farmers in how to process tomatoes. So you see from the picture there that sometimes there's oversupply of tomatoes. And when they are oversupplied, then they go to waste like that. So is there a way that they can add value and always have tomatoes to sell? Or if not tomatoes, then the processed goods that result from that. Next slide, please. And that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for that perspective from research and the role of research in food systems.